Alrighty, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I want to welcome you all to a very happy World Ocean Week. I hope you're all enjoying celebrating our beautiful oceans this week. Um, Second, my name is Lily. I am an interpretive ranger here at Natural Bridges State Beach, and I'm really excited about the virtual field trip. As I in the beginning mentioned, I'll be talking grab a couple of things before we really dive into everything. First thing you want is something to write with. And second thing is a piece of paper, a couple of pieces of paper. If you think you want to take a lot to the audience, go ahead and write down the answer to this question or turn to somebody next to you and discuss what you think the answer to the question is. So if you got that piece of paper ready, you may be ready to write down your answers. We'll also be doing just a little bit of nature journaling towards the end of the program, so make sure to leave yourself some room for doodling. And without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started? So once again, I am here at Natural Bridges State Beach. As soon as this loads, it'll show you a nice little Google Earth of where exactly I am. I'm here in California. Oh, we're having some loading issues this morning, apparently. Let me see if I can turn down the quality just a little bit. See that I am here in California. I'm in Santa Cruz, which is just about an hour and a half south of San Francisco, and we're right along the northern edge of the Monterey Bay. As I mentioned, I'm here at Natural Bridges State Beach. This is the beach of Natural Bridges State Beach. And you can see right in the middle of the ocean there's this big old rock. And that rock is the bridge that the park is named for. You can see that the ocean has punched a hole right in the middle of that rock, but that didn't used to be the only rock that we ever had. There used to be two more bridges that have since fallen, unfortunately. And I will make myself just a little bigger so that you can see them. The first bridge used to be right here between this part that's attached to the mainland and a little further out to the current bridge. There also used to be another one that went from the current bridge to that tiny little rock right out there in the ocean. So there used to be three bridges. Now we only have one, but we've got something pretty cool going on the beach here. We're going to zoom in right here on the rocks, and I'll show you what we have happening. If it loads. Well, if my slides decide to cooperate with me, you would see there is a big old hole in the rock where we zoomed in earlier. There it is, big old hole in the rock. So what happened was a couple of years ago, we had some really big storms here in Santa Cruz. The ocean was super rough. And when things finally cleared and we could safely go back onto the beach, we found that there was a hole in the rock. It started off about the size of a dinner plate, not very big. And now a couple of years later, it's even bigger than in the video I had there. It's gotten so much larger that people can crawl through it. So at some point, that will erode enough that we'll have another natural bridge. So that is very exciting for the park. Geology today, we are here to talk about the tide pools. So tide pools are a really cool phenomenon we have here in California. Have you ever been to a tide pool before? Maybe some of you already know some things about tide pools. Maybe some of you don't know anything about tide pools. Either is okay. We're going to learn all about them today. This is what the tide pool shelf at Natural Bridges looks like. You can see there's these big rock flat with all these little holes in the middle of it, and those holes are all filled with water where all kinds of ocean animals live. This video here is hopefully a time lapse of the tide pool shelf at Natural Bridges State Beach. You'll see it changing throughout the day. And what do you think is going to happen with that change? Do you think the water level is going to stay the same throughout the entire day? Do you think the water is going to get higher than it is right now? Do you think it's going to get lower? Keep it in your brain, and then we'll watch together to see what exactly happens to that outlined tide pooling area as the day progresses. So there you see, you might already be able to tell the ocean is lowering. As the day goes on, the water is covering less and less of that tide pool area. So this is what happens every single day, twice a day along the California coast. We call this phenomenon tides. The tides rise up, the ocean level rises a couple feet, and then it comes back down a couple feet twice a day. At high tide, that's what we saw in the beginning when the entire tide pool shelf is covered in water. And low tide is what happens when the water has receded. And low tide is when people want to be out there tide pooling. Towards the end of our video there, you might have been able to see there were more and more people walking around on the tide pool shelf. And they're doing what we're going to be virtually doing today, looking into all these different tide pools and seeing what kinds of animals the ocean has revealed for us. So this is another diagram of the tide pool shelf at Natural Bridges, but I've drawn these little lines across it. These lines across the tide pool shelf represent different habitats in the tide pools. Now, I use the word habitat. Do you know what a habitat is? If you think you know what a habitat is, go ahead and tell a person next to you or write it down in your notebook. What do you think a habitat is? So some of you may be familiar with what a habitat is. A habitat is just a place, it can be any place at all, that things live. So that's pretty broad, but not all habitats are the same, right? Are you going to find the same plants and animals living in a desert as you would find living in a redwood forest? Definitely not. So the zones that we have and these little lines that we have drawn across are different habitats of the tide pools. And I give you a little spoiler, we call them zones in tide pool shelf. This is all zones of the tide pools labeled. And you can see starting from farthest away from the ocean, we have the splash zone, the low tide zone, and the subtidal zone. Because of the way the ocean rises and falls every single day, each one of those zones get different effects that are changing what animals live inside of them. So they have very different animals and habitats. And we'll be talking about each one of these zones, breaking it up piece by piece and meeting some of the cool animals that live there. First, let's start farthest away from the ocean in the splash zone. What are some things that you notice about these tide pools in the splash zone? Go ahead and write something down or tell someone next to you, what is something that you noticed about these tide pools? There are a lot of great things that you could notice about the splash zone tide pools. One thing that I noticed is that they look kind of hot. It looks like it might not be a very cool place to live if you are an animal. They also look pretty dry. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot of water in our splash zone tide pools. But these tide pools are not lifeless. There are plenty of things living in them. In fact, you'll be able to see a video where there's all kinds of animals zipping around inside of that tide pool there. Now, they're not big animals. They're pretty little. But when you peek under the surface, you can see there's definitely life, even in the splash zone tide pools. So everywhere has a little bit of something living there. Now, the biggest challenge in the tide pools in the splash zone is water loss. Like we said, it gets pretty warm in those splash zone tide pools, which means water tends to evaporate. So the animals that live in the splash zone have to be well adapted to water loss. Now, what was that word that I just used there? Adapted. If you think you know the definition of the word adapted or adaptation, go ahead and write it down on your piece of paper or tell somebody next to you. What does adapted mean? What is an adaptation? I'm sure you had some great answers. An adaptation is the way that an animal's body has changed over a long period of time to better suit its environment. One classic example of an adaptation is how ducks have webbed feet. Their webbed feet help them swim a lot better, so they're well adapted to living in the water. So the animals in the splash zone have to be adapted to living in conditions where they're not going to have very much water. Here are a couple of the cool animals that we'll meet in the splash zone. Starting off right above me, we have barnacles, limpets on the other side there, periwinkle snails, and one of my personal favorites on the other end, copepods. Let's start off with our friend the periwinkle snail. I want everyone to take your thumb and look at it and imagine dividing it into 4 pieces. Periwinkle snails are even smaller than that. They're smaller than your pinky nail. They're very, very little, which means that they could dry out really fast. But they have some cool adaptations that help them stay moist. One adaptation is this shell that they have. That shell protects most of their body from drying out, and it also protects it from predators. The other cool adaptation they have is this word I've got written down on the other end here. The word is operculum. Can you say that with me? Operculum. That operculum is that little circle that's around the front entrance to that snail's home. You can see here, this is the squishy foot of the snail, and it's covering the entrance to its house with this operculum. And that operculum is a hard substance. It's the same substance that your fingernails are made out of. And they're able to close the front end of their shell, sort of like a front door. And when they do that, they're able to keep water inside so they don't dry out. This animal is called a rough limpet. You can see it's called a rough limpet because it's got such a spiky outline on the outside of its shell. And rough limpets use suction to suck down to the rock. And they suck down to the rock so hard that they don't lose, that no water escapes in between them and the rock. Rough limpets also have homes. They live on the rocks of the tide pools, but they have a spot that they go back to every time. And every time they go back to that spot, it wears away just a little bit. So there's a small scar on the rock. It's called a home scar. And it's perfectly outlined to that particular limpet. And having that particular home scar makes them suck down just a little bit better so that they lose even less water. These are acorn barnacles. If you ever visit the tide pools, you will see these guys everywhere. Acorn barnacles have a front little beak, and that beak can close and hold the water in, similar to the snail's operculum. But there's something interesting that I'm seeing about some of these different acorn barnacles. What do you notice about the acorn barnacles that are next to us? We have some that look a little bit different than the others. This one here looks like it has a front little beak like that. That means it's still got an acorn barnacle living inside of it. And that acorn barnacle is keeping itself moist by closing that front door. But I see some that look like this. These don't have living acorn barnacles in them anymore. There used to be a barnacle there. It made its whole shell casing there, and then it eventually died. And there's no more barnacle inside, but the casing is still there. Now, this is a super cool animal. In fact, this is the same animal that we saw zipping around in the splash zone tide pool video that I showed you earlier. They're very, very small, almost microscopic, and they are called a copepod. Copepods are kind of like the Tidepool superheroes. They can survive really, really rough conditions. In fact, they can survive almost anything. So we're going to play a little game here. I'm going to give you a scenario that happens to our splash zone tide pool. And afterwards, together, we're going to say copepods survive it all. Now, all the scenarios I'm about to tell you are really survivable by those copepods. Anything that I'm about to say, copepods really can survive it. So let's see how resilient they are. First, we'll start off with a very normal, beautiful day in our splash zone tide pool. Not too hot, not too cold, the water's perfect. Well, of course, copepods survive it all. How about if it gets a little bit warm and the water starts to evaporate from our pool? And when that water evaporates, it leaves its salt behind. So our pool gets really salty. Copepods survive it all. How about if all of a sudden a rainstorm comes through and our pool gets much less salty? Copepods survive it all. What if it's another hot day and the pool gets really warm? It heats up a lot. Copepods survive it all. What if it gets so warm our pool dries out completely? Copepods survive it all. Comes in and drenches our pool, and all of a sudden it's really cold in here. Copepods survive it all. So copepods are a really strong and hardy little tide pool animal. That's why they're one of my favorites and why I call them our tide pool superheroes, because they seem almost invincible compared to a lot of animals. Let's take another couple steps towards the ocean into the high tide zone tide pools. Now, this picture looks a little bit different than the one that we used for the splash zone tide pools. What do you notice about the high tide zone that's different from the splash zone? You can go ahead and write something down or tell someone next to you. What's the difference between the high tide zone and the splash zone? Well, there's many different things that you could notice. One thing that I noticed is that it looks like there's more water here. I also noticed that there's in here. These little black dots are snails, and they're leaving cute little trails in the sand pieces. So this environment is a little bit different than the splash zone. Water loss is definitely still a big problem, but they also have to deal with protection from the sun. These animals have to be adapted to not losing water, and they need to be adapted to not getting so warm or damaged by the sun. So a couple of the animals that we'll meet in the high tide zone are anemones, lined shore crabs, and as we mentioned earlier, a couple of snails. These are black turban snails. Let's start off with our friend the anemone. Both pictures on the screen are pictures of anemones, but they're pretty different. Go ahead and write down a couple of differences or tell someone next to you, what are some differences between these two pictures that are both sea anemones? Well, there's many different things you could have noticed. Something that I noticed is that this anemone here looks like it's not underwater. It's actually exposed to the air. But the anemones on the other side there, they are underwater. Another thing that I'm noticing is this anemone here is really closed up and it's covered in shells and sand. The other anemones on the other side are open, their tentacles are out, and they're not covered in shells and sand. Adaptation that the anemones have to prevent themselves from getting too dry or from the sun. When they're out of the water, they close their tentacles up because if they're closed up like this, they're able to keep more water near their body so they don't dry out. They collect all of these shells and pieces of sand on purpose. When the water washes over them and little bits of shells and sand wash over them, they grab onto them purposefully because they use it like a shield. They put the shells between themselves and the sun, and they use it like a shield or a sunscreen so they don't get damaged by the sun. And then once they're back underwater, they're not as worried about the sun, they're not worried about drying out, then they can open up like the ones on the other side of the screen are doing. This is our friend the black turban snail. The black turban snails are pretty similar to the periwinkle snails in their adaptation, but they're much bigger. If the periwinkle snail is even smaller than your pinky fingernail, a black turban snail is usually about the size of a thumbnail, maybe a little bit smaller. So they're pretty big. The black turban snails in this photo are totally dried out on the outside. You can see that their shells look pretty dull. There's no water on them. But that doesn't mean that the snails inside are dead. In fact, they're probably doing okay because of that same structure we talked about earlier. Do you remember what it was called that the periwinkle snails used to keep themselves moist inside? It was called an operculum. And the black turban snails have those too. They're able to close that front door to their shell and keep all of that water inside. This is another favorite of mine, the lined shore crab. It's called a lined shore crab because you can see it's got all these very handsome stripes along its back there. And the lined shore crab is doing something kind of weird. What's kind of silly about this photo here of our lined shore crab? It's covered in bubbles. Why is it covered in bubbles? Well, it's a pretty cool adaptation. This lined shore crab didn't just get hit with a whole bunch of sea foam. It actually made those bubbles. See, lined shore crabs have a nice hard shell. So if the outside of their body dries out, they're okay because, again, that shell prevents the inside of their body from drying out. The one really sensitive part of their body that is exposed is their gills. They use those gills to breathe, and if those gills dry out, then they have a really big problem. So to prevent their gills from drying out, lined shore crabs blow bubbles with their gills. Those bubbles keep their gills nice and moist, and it kind of looks like they're having a little bubble bath party. So next time you see a crab that's wandering outside of the tide pools, check and see what it's doing with its gills because it might be covering itself in bubbles. Let's take another couple of steps closer to the ocean into the mid-tide zone. Now, this picture looks pretty different from the last couple of pictures we've seen. So go ahead, let's do this again. Talk to your neighbor or write something down. What are some differences you notice about the mid-tide zone compared to the other areas we've explored today? There's tons of different things you could have noticed. Something that I noticed is this pool looks like it's filled with a lot more water, and it looks deeper too. I'm also noticing that this picture has a lot more different kinds of animals than the last pictures that we've seen. I can see some anemones in the pools. I can see all kinds of mussels and shells on the outside of the pools. So it seems like this area is pretty diverse. Well, that's true. The mid-tide zone doesn't have to worry so much about the sun beating down, and it doesn't have to worry so much about all the water evaporating. But it does still have to be well adapted to something else, rough waves. How many of you have ever been to the beach? And when you go to the beach towards the ocean, you are standing right by the shore and you get knocked down by a big old wave. It's happened to me before. Well, that is what the mid-tide zone animals have to deal with all day, every day. They're constantly being hit with big waves, so the animals that live there need to be really well stuck onto those rocks. So let's talk about some of the animals and how they are adapted to holding onto the rocks. Right behind me, we have another sea anemone. This particular kind is a giant green anemone. We have a mussel, blue mussels, and we have owl limpets. So let's talk about our anemones. Now, the last photo was of a giant green anemone. That's this one right here. But this next photo is a sunburst anemone, closely related, but two different species. How do you think I was able to tell the difference so easily? There's one key difference. Some of you might be saying color, and that can be true. Sometimes, though, they almost look like they're the same color in different lights. The main way to tell the difference is that this sunburst anemone has tons of stripes in between its tentacles on the outside and its mouth, which is right in the middle there. Let me go back to our giant green and you can see there's no stripes in between the mouth of the animal here and the tentacles on the outside. Now, both the giant green anemone and the sunburst anemone have the same adaptation to stick onto the rocks. They have a really, really strong suction cup on the bottom of their body. And they use that suction cup to suck onto the rocks really, really hard. That way, as soon as a big wave comes in, they don't end up floating around in the ocean. These here are barnacles again. Now, remember what we talked about earlier. A barnacle that has an alive barnacle in it has a little cap like this on the top. Do these barnacles here look like they still have an alive animal in them, or are they not alive anymore? What do you think? If you're thinking that these barnacles don't have alive animals in them, you'd be correct. If you look inside each of these little shells here, it's just a hole. There's no barnacle in them. But the shell is still stuck onto this piece of wood here. How did they do that? Well, it's their adaptation for clinging onto the rocks. Barnacles use a really, really strong glue to permanently glue themselves to the rocks and pieces of wood. That means that once that barnacle settles down, it's not moving ever again. And that glue is so strong that it can stay even after the living barnacle is long gone. So they have that really extra strong super glue. This is a California mussel. Not muscle like your big strong muscles, mussel like M-U-S-S-E-L. And a mussel is sort of similar to a clam. It's not quite a clam, but if you have ever seen a clam, it's got those two shells like that. Well, mussels are the same. They're called bivalves. Bi means two, valve meaning shell, two shells. And this mussel is at sort of a weird angle for this photo. It's sitting like this. So we're looking at the back end of it, and this is the end that opens. And that mussel is holding onto the rocks using what's called byssal threads. I have it spelled right above me, byssal threads. Now, each one of these little sticky threads is coming out from the mussel itself. Do you think just one thread is enough to keep it stuck to the rocks? Probably not. That's why this mussel has a whole bunch of threads that help keep it stuck to the rocks. It's sort of like Spider-Man, where every time it needs to stick to a rock, it'll shoot out a nice little web and stick down really well. And then if it does even more and more and more, it sticks down even better. Luckily, if all of those threads were to snap, maybe there was an extra big wave that came through and it washed our mussel off, wherever they settle down, they can just make more of those byssal threads to continue to cling onto those rocks. Now, this is another awesome animal that we have. This is called an owl limpet. You might recall we talked about one kind of limpet earlier, the rough limpet. This is another kind here, the owl limpet. Owl limpets are much bigger. In fact, they're about this big, or they can be this big. And owl limpets stick to the rocks kind of similarly to snails. On the underside of their body, they have a big hard shell like this, and underneath it, they have a very soft body. And that soft body has a really large suction cup foot that they use to suction onto the rocks and stick down. But that's not the only interesting thing about this photo here. Go ahead and think to yourself, talk to a friend, write down on a piece of paper, what are some interesting things that you notice about the photo behind me? Well, there's a lot of really cool things you can notice. One cool thing that I notice is that there's all these little scrapes along the rock. Did you notice that? They're kind of hard to see, but there's all these little scratch marks on the rock. Something else that I notice is that this area around our limpet seems pretty clear. There's a couple of mussels in the corner here, but it does not seem very crowded. Well, that's because our owl limpet is keeping that area clear on purpose. Owl limpets are farmers. They eat a microscopic algae and they keep a patch of the rock clear so that that algae can grow. They make sure mussels and other snails and all kinds of things don't come and settle in that area to crowd their little farms. And then they'll eat one area, and then another area will grow, so they'll go eat that area. And then another area will grow, so they'll eat that area. So they farm their little algae patches. Another super cool thing about owl limpets is they all start as male when they're very, very small. And then eventually, when they get bigger, they turn into females. So all of these big owl limpets who are farming here are all females. That's pretty cool, isn't it? Now, let's go even closer to the ocean, to the low tide zone. What do you notice about the low tide zone compared to the other areas we've explored today? Once again, you can talk to a neighbor or you can write it down on your piece of paper. What do you notice about the low tide zone? Well, there's many cool things that you could be noticing right now. One thing that I notice is it looks like there's a lot of water in the low tide zone. And that's true because the low tide zone is very rarely out of water. It's underwater a lot of the time, and so it's only occasionally exposed. I'm also noticing that those pools seem pretty big. So it seems like maybe there's a lot of animals that could live in them. Well, the low tide zone, like we said, is almost always underwater. And because the conditions are so nice, well, a lot of animals want to live there. And when a lot of animals want to live there, there isn't enough space for everybody. So those areas get very, very crowded. The low tide zone is a very crowded area for tide pool animals. And whenever an area gets crowded, the predators are going to come in to try to get their next meal. So the animals that live in the low tide zone have to be well adapted to both making sure they have enough space and making sure they're not going to get eaten by predators. A couple of the cool animals we'll talk about in the low tide zone are sea stars here, purple sea urchins, and once again, our friend, the anemone. Let's start off with sea stars. Sometimes people call them starfish, but since they're not really a fish, marine biologists call them sea stars. Now, sea stars have a couple of different ways they avoid getting eaten. One has to do with whatever's going on in the middle of this sea star leg here. What do you think is going on in the middle of that sea star leg? You can think to yourself or write it down or talk to someone. What is happening in this photo? Well, in the middle of this sea star leg are actually its feet. Each one of these little white things here that sort of, to me, looks like a macaroni noodle, these are all called tube feet. And they have many, many tube feet that use water pressure to move the sea star across the rocks. So if a sea star thinks that there's a predator coming, or maybe it starts to get too warm and it wants to move, all it has to do is start moving its little feet into another area. But there's another thing that prevents it from getting eaten, and that has to do with the texture of its skin. Sea stars are really, really rough. So that doesn't make a very appetizing meal for most predators. Most predators are looking for something with a lot of nutrition that's easy to eat, and a sea star is definitely not easy to eat. Speaking of not easy to eat, this is our purple sea urchin. Purple sea urchins have tons of spikes all along the outside of their body that makes it really impossible to eat it whole. The only part of the urchin that a predator could eat is inside of the animal if it's able to break through all of those spines and its shell. And of course, it has to get through all those spines first. The purple sea urchin has another adaptation that it does to prevent itself from getting eaten by predators. Besides its spine, what do you notice about this picture here, particularly where the urchin is situated in the rock? Well, it's in the rock. It's not sitting on top of the rock like this. It's carved a little hole, so it's sitting under and inside. Now, that means that that sea urchin is really well protected from predators because the only way a predator could get it is if it came from the top. But it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. This sea urchin has to be really careful because if its hole gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but the opening stays the same, well, eventually that urchin might not be able to get back out of its hole. So they have to be careful making themselves a nice little cubby inside the rock there, because otherwise they could end up stuck in it. This is our friend, the giant green anemone. Now, how can you tell me that this is a giant green anemone besides reading the label? Do you remember from a couple slides ago? That's right, it doesn't have any stripes. If you look at its mouth right here and its tentacles right here, and you look between them, there's no stripes. And that means it's a giant green anemone and not a sunburst anemone. If it had stripes, it would be a sunburst anemone. So giant green anemones and sunburst anemones have the same adaptation for avoiding getting eaten by predators. It's also the same way that they hunt. Inside of each of these tentacles are a bunch of cells that sting. Those cells have tiny little harpoons inside of them, and they shoot out when something brushes against them. And they shoot out a little bit of a neurotoxin that paralyzes the prey or the predator that's trying to eat it. So if something brushes against these tentacles, they get a nasty little sting and they could get paralyzed if it's small enough. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, hold on, Lily. I've touched a sea anemone before. Maybe you were at an aquarium. Maybe you were at an area that was okay to touch the anemones. But if you've touched an anemone before, you probably didn't feel any stinging. That's because, luckily, humans, our skin on our hands is too thick and too tough for these tiny little stinging cells to really affect us. But if you were the size of an animal that might be trying to eat an anemone, or if you were a really little fish or microscopic plankton and the anemone was trying to eat you, you would definitely feel that sting. So they have that cool adaptation that we might never know of if we weren't able to study them with science. And finally, we are going to put on our bathing suits and our wetsuits, put on your goggles, maybe a little snorkel, and we are going to dive into the ocean, into the subtidal zone. Subtidal means underwater. That word sub means under, tidal meaning ocean. So this is the underwater zone. The subtidal zone is never out of the ocean. It's always underwater. And it's super diverse. There's all kinds of animals that live all the way under the water. Do you have a favorite subtidal zone animal? If you do, you can tell someone next to you or write it down, maybe even do a little doodle. What is your favorite subtidal zone animal? Remember, that's an animal that lives in the ocean underwater all the time. There are tons of amazing animals I'm sure you've thought up. One of my favorites are whales. I think they're super neat. You might also like fish, an octopus, a sea slug. There's all kinds of great animals that live in the subtidal zone. And the subtidal zone's biggest challenge is people. Now, people who enjoy nature responsibly and don't take too much from it are a great part of the ecosystem. But sometimes people take too much. People can damage our subtidal ecosystems. And that can be the biggest challenge for those underwater areas. This is why we have special places called marine protected areas. That's a long phrase, so let's break down all three words. Marine protected area. What does the word marine mean? Marine means underwater. How about protected? What happens when you protect something? You guard it from being harmed. And an area is just a place. It can be any place. So a marine protected area is an underwater place that we guard from harm. Natural Bridges State Beach is one of 124 California marine protected areas. And what that means is when people come to Natural Bridges, they're not allowed to take any of the animals. What happens is you have these marine protected areas, like you can see on the other side here, where animals are not fished, not taken, or it's very strictly regulated if they are taken at all. And those areas become very diverse and very crowded, like our low tide zone area. And eventually they become so crowded that animals overflow, they spill over into the unprotected areas. And that way, fishermen are able to catch some of them there. So this model, the marine protected areas, they benefit the animals and they benefit the nature by setting aside protected places where the animals can live, but it also benefits the fishermen. Remember, fishermen aren't bad. They're trying to make their own lives just by fishing the fish. And the marine protected areas make sure that they never run out of fish to catch. So it benefits everybody. Like I said, Natural Bridges is a marine protected area. It goes all the way from Natural Bridges State Beach through Wilder Ranch State Park, which is a couple miles long. And it mostly protects the tide pools and their incredibly diverse animals. So when you come to a marine protected area, what are some good things that you can do to help protect those animals as well? Well, one thing that you can do is never touching or picking up the animals. If you touch them or pick them up, you're causing them stress. Even if you touch gently, there are some animals who don't even like that. So you don't want to touch or pick up any of the animals. You also don't want to move them around in between different pools. When you move them between different pools, you're changing that animal's habitat. You're changing its home. It probably wouldn't be very good to you to be picked up out of your house and put in some other random house. And that's how it is for the tide pool animals as well. They have areas that they live on purpose, and you don't want to change where they're living. You also want to make sure that you're walking very, very gently if you come out to the tide pools. Don't go into any of the pools and step outside very carefully because you never know when there's an alive animal right underneath your feet. So walk very gently. You also don't want to turn over any rocks. Underneath that rock could be all kinds of animals that are hiding. They're trying to make their own lives by hiding from predators, or they found their own little ecosystem. And when you turn it over, you're ruining their hiding spot. You're ruining their micro ecosystem, even if you put that rock right back where you found it. So don't flip over rocks. So again, our main rules when you visit a tide pool, if you want to help protect the animals, please don't touch the animals. Please don't pick them up. And definitely don't move them to other pools. Walk very carefully and don't turn over rocks. A good rule of thumb is to just look with your eyes and don't look with your hands. And especially, don't collect anything. Don't take anything home with you, living or not living. If you take home even shells or rocks, another tide pool animal could have used that, and you don't want to take anything home that the animals could use. Thank you all so much for joining me for this program. If you have any questions that you think of, you'll have time to put them into the Q&A and ask me your questions, and I will answer them. If you think of a question later that you don't have time to ask, or maybe you're feeling shy, you don't want to ask right now, if you send an email to this email address right here, we'll answer your question and make sure that you get whatever you need. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do just a little bit of nature journaling. I am going to turn on this super cool background here, and you are going to get a chance to look inside of the tide pool and draw whatever it is you want to draw. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and then I'm going to come back. I'll look in our Q&A, and I'll answer some questions. So go ahead, enjoy 5 minutes of this super cool tide pool. All righty, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of time getting to draw a little bit, enjoying our beautiful tide pool here. So I am going to take a look at our Q&A now and see what's going on. I see some folks have been answering along to our questions. That's wonderful. Somebody asked at one point, how did you get the picture? I'm not sure which picture you were talking about, but most of these pictures I was able to take in the park at Natural Bridges using an underwater camera or sometimes an out of water camera. So pretty cool what an underwater camera can do. Let's see. Okay. A lot of wonderful comments. Got a lot of comments. All right, yes, a lot of comments. So some folks have asked about the green screen background that we have. This is indeed a green screen, but this video is a real video of a real tide pool at Natural Bridges. It was just taken with a really nice underwater camera. So everything that you're happening is 100% real. Some folks had some questions about things that were going on in this background. So like, for example, this right here is a hermit crab, and you can see it's trying to crawl over this anemone here. Luckily, that hermit crab has some pretty strong skin, so it's not going to get hurt by that anemone there, but it is certainly trying to make a break for it, crawling over that anemone. I'm not seeing a lot of other questions. I do see a couple of people have raised hands. In this particular presentation, if you have a question, I'm going to ask you to please put it inside of the Q&A because I will not be choosing people to ask questions out loud. I see somebody asking, oh, what is the location? This is, again, at Natural Bridges State Beach, which is in Santa Cruz, California. So I mentioned earlier, Santa Cruz is on the northern edge of the Monterey Bay, and we're about an hour and a half of San Francisco, an hour and a half south of San Francisco. So we're here in Central California. I see folks still asking if this is a real background. Like I said, obviously I'm not underwater right now. This is a green screen, but the video is real. This is not pretend. This is not AI. This is a real video of what it looks like underwater in a tide pool. Alrighty, folks. If you have any other questions, what is the little crab hidden in the back? Oh, we do have a crab in this video. I'm trying to find it because it moves around through different parts of the video. So we have all kinds of little hermit crabs. Those hermit crabs use snail shells to protect their squishy part of their body. And then they move around on little legs like these guys right here and like this guy back here. There is a much larger crab in this video, but I'm having trouble finding it right now. It might scurry through at some point later on during the video. Alrighty, my friends. Well, I'm not seeing a ton of other questions. If you think of a question, if you have another question, please feel free to email us at naturalbridges@ports-ca.us. We would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining me today. Thank you again for joining World Ocean Week and celebrating our beautiful oceans. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your World Ocean Week. And I hope to see you in a California.